This is part 2 of my summer wrap-up. Welcome!
The next book I read was The Whale Rider by Witi Himera, which I just loved a lot. It's a, pretty short book. I loved it a lot. I actually combined read and listened to this, and I enjoyed that process. The audiobook is actually a slightly different edition. It's an updated edition, which I thought was interesting, and it's also updated for American, so there are some language changes that have been made, which is interesting, because in my book, obviously like audio, you can't check a glossary in quite the same way, although some audiobooks do have like supplementary material to look through. This book does have a glossary. I don't think it's a very well organised or particularly easy to use glossary. Actually, I will say, I think, for example, sometimes it translates one word, but that one singular word is not being used as one single word, it's used in a phrase, and the phrase clearly doesn't mean each. Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't give you it doesn't give you the meaning, even if maybe it gives you the ostensible meaning. But even then, it was a bit, I think it's a bit haphazard, I guess, but obviously it was useful to have, and I definitely prefer to have a glossary and to have what people actually refer to things in the book and have to do a bit more work. That's all fine, I don't mind, but I just think it wasn't very well laid out. But this book is about Kahu, who is a child from the Wangara tribe of Maori people in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and she is the grandchild of the elder of the tribe, and he doesn't like the fact that she's a girl and not a boy, and he has a lot of very particular ideas about tradition and gender, and it is just about how wrong he is. But it's also just lovely. It's very alive. It is about life, aliveness, spirit, ancestors, and it centers a lot on this particular ancestor who was a whale rider called Kahutia Terangi. Kahu is named after this ancestor, and I guess her tribe is kind of struggling a lot for multiple reasons, and she kind of has to sort of step in to herself and also to her people in order to help. It's quite slight in its attention to this, but this is also an interesting book in terms of the environment and the way that Indigenous people generally, and obviously Maori people in specific in Aotearoa, are kind of stewards and protectors of the land, and the land is an ancestor, the sea, the beings in the sea, this is vital relationship. It's not being sufficiently cared to or given space for, thanks to imperialist Western white concepts of the land. I'm saying this really weird, but basically I'm just saying this is a good book about the environment and about the difference between Indigenous versus non-Indigenous approaches towards caring for the world, and looking after the environment and the people. My phone died, so I don't know what I was saying, but I think I'm gonna move on. But I was talking about this, and it's great. We're in the home straits. The next book I read was The Austere Academy, which is the fifth book in a series of unfortunate events, and it was good. So this one is the book where Count Olaf takes on a disguise which includes wearing a turban, and then he says that he won't take the turban off because of religious reasons, so it just feels pretty uncomfortable. Aside from that, I think it's fine. The next book I read was something I read whilst I was at the seaside, so that was nice. So this is Happiness as Such by Natalia Ginzburg. I just hit myself in the face. Translated by Mina Salmon Proctor. It was great to return to Ginzburg, I hadn't for quite a little while, and it was really nice to return. I think she's very interested, isn't she, in what happens when love leaves, sort of after, which I think makes total sense in terms of what she lived through. The big event happened, but then after, what happens? Either in a marriage, for example, people get divorced or something, but they still have some kind of bond or relationship, or after an event like the Second World War and what happens then. And she kind of puts them two together, really, because it is, especially in terms of social bonds between people, they are massively impacted, aren't they, by these major events, but then also it comes out in the minutiae of family life or whatever. This book was kind of painful, I guess, funny, just like her others, like definitely funny. But yeah, so this is about Michele, I think is how it's pronounced. He's the beloved only son of a large dysfunctional family in 1970s Rome. So he's sort of like the space that the novel kind of centers around. And I do think it was strange, and it also felt quite truthful about family relationships and grief, I guess, going on. It's also obviously, as you can kind of tell from the title, like it is about happiness or lack thereof, or kind of accepting what is in your life and like what you have access to as your baseline of like happiness potential, I guess. And sort of, I guess, the inciting kind of incident, but that makes it seem much more like intense and like thriller-y than it is. Like it is very sort of mundane, but obviously like these major things are happening. But yeah, so Michele, like, he leaves Rome as a result of some like political stuff that he is part of, like radical politics. And so yeah, he leaves and he goes to England, and it's sort of about what happens as a result of that travel. I'm not sure I'm totally convinced that it's like majorly him traveling that sets that off. Other things happen too, like his father does die. His father's very sick and he's like dying, and then he does die at some point, and so it's sort of also about the ramifications of all of that as well. And then I think Michele is a really interesting character, I guess, and there's definitely some stuff in here where characters say he's queer, like say he's gay, bisexual, whatever. There's actually also a really funny bit, which I think I did try to film actually, where his sisters are talking about his sexuality, and one of them says like, he'll never get married, Michele will never have a family of his own, he's gay. The other sister says, you wish he was, said Angelica. He's a homosexual, said Viola. Haven't you figured out that he and Osvaldo were lovers? You wish, said Angelica. While she was saying, you wish, she realised that it was exactly what she'd always thought. Michele had a girlfriend, and he's probably the father of her baby, she said. Because he's bisexual, said Viola. Osvaldo has a daughter, said Angelica. Is he bisexual too? Bisexual, said Viola. Like, obviously, I think you are left to kind of interpret some things as you would want, I guess. And there definitely aren't any direct answers from Michele, but like, he's not a straight man, I think. And so some of it's also kind of written in a sort of strange way too, in the sense that you get third person description. So like, if it starts with Adriana, I think is the mother's name. It starts with, a woman awoke in her new house. Her name was Adriana. It was snowing outside, and her birthday, she was 43 years old. The house was in the country. The village was visible from the house on a hilltop 2 kilometers away. 15 kilometers to the city. Adriana had moved in 10 days earlier. She pulled on a light tobacco brown robe. That's such a classic Ginzburg beginning. But so it's written like that, and then we also get a lot of letters. So we get a letter that she's writing Michele, and we get letters from him, and like we also get letters from his sisters and stuff like that. But then we also get more just like third person narrative about other stuff, like meetings between other people and blah blah blah. There's also, okay, so I guess I'm going to put like a little spoiler warning here, so maybe skip ahead until I'm holding up the next book, because I do want to talk about it, I guess, because basically this particular instance of like fascist violence happens in this book. So, and I was actually reading this like around the time when a bunch of white supremacists took to the streets to be disgusting and violent towards Muslims and migrants, and that was obviously horrible. And I was reading this around the same time, and like Michele, he gets killed by a fascist in Leeds, I think after some kind of protest, but I can't quite remember the details. And it's very shocking and it's very sudden, and like the radical politics that he was involved with were like far left politics. It's not especially clear, and obviously he doesn't ever speak to it either, but he like is hiding someone's gun in his flat, for example, and there's reference to like a particular kind of sort of like socialist brigade, I think. So we know he's anti-fascist is what I'm saying, I guess. But so then he's murdered, and we also get mixed accounts, because we get like a letter about it from one of his sisters and then from another, and like they sort of say different things, or they do say different things. I don't know why I said that, but and I just felt like that was actually a reason why this novel felt more powerful and more true to me, and more painful. I can't figure out what I'm trying to say about it, but if you have read this, or if you have thoughts about the sort of inclusion of that, definitely like please talk to me. I'd love to speak to people who've read this book and have thoughts about it. I definitely would have thought intensely and felt strongly about it if I hadn't been reading it at the time I was, but obviously because I was, it was even more stark and even more intense. And you know, white supremacy and fascism have never been adequately defeated, and that's one of the reasons why we're in such an appalling mess that we are in. The sort of like denazification, defascisation that people have this idea of happening after the Second World War never really happened, or certainly didn't happen in quite the way it should have. I don't think people hold the line enough against fascist white supremacist rhetoric, and I don't just mean like Keir Starmer, because I mean obviously I mean Keir Starmer, but I also mean within the left. I think we cede way too much ground to a lot of stuff and a lot of conversations about safety especially, and we need to get better and cleverer about that. I don't know, okay? If you're an anti-fascist, I love you. If you're a Muslim, I love you. Like, anyway, I guess like me just like crying as I talk about books is like part of the actual spinster experience. So the next book I didn't read in full, but I sort of included it as a read book, and that's Not by Birth Alone, Conversion to Judaism by Walter Jacob, Walter Homolka and Esther Seidel. So yeah, this is like a collection of essays, and it was like split into sections. There was like a bit about conversion to Judaism, like historically, like from, you know, very, very early conversions, like in Talmud, and then also from, you know, from like the medieval era into the modern day, like the 20th century. This book was published in the 1990s, so, you know, some of it's dated, and there was some discussion about the state of Israel that was interesting in that context. There was some interesting discussion about the way that like American Reform Jews pin their identity, like their Jewish identity, onto Israel and want it to be validated by Israel in a way that was very interesting in the context of the current fragmentation for it, like with the Jewish community in terms of like supporting and or opposing Israel and Israel's actions, and also the sort of implications of the law of return for Jews in general, just as much as converts, you know, seeing kind of conversion and like approaches to converts as like a litmus test for like Jews as a whole, Reform Jews especially, but also just like Jewish identity too. Anyway, so like I'm not sure if that will make sense if you don't know anything or care very much about Jewish identity, but yeah, there was also people's like own experiences. I actually think my favourite piece was by Rabbi Lionel Blue, and it was like called Insiders and Outsiders, and he talked about his experience of like teaching prospective converts, and it was just really like lovely. I really liked it as like a generous meditation on what it means to be an insider versus an outsider and what Judaism offers people. And he said something like, I'm actually gonna cry, but like he said something like Judaism is supposed to be like a religious home, not a prison, and I just like love that as like a way to think about it and like say that. And yeah, I really liked that bit. So yeah, and like some of it was more or less interesting, and some of the people were more or less weird about Israel. It just kind of depended. So like definitely a mixed bag, but I'm glad I read it, and some of it was definitely really interesting. So I did actually, I know I said in my TBR that I was going to read this in Shorty September. I actually just read the 3 stories in here that are Glass family related before because I wanted to. So yeah, this is For Esme with Love and Squalor by J.D. Salinger. It's a short story collection, but I didn't read all of these. I just read A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, and Down at the Dinghy. I'm not sure which one I like the best. I mean, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish is where Seymour kills himself, so who's gonna say they enjoyed that? But then, you know, it was also kind of sweet. But yeah, it was also really funny. There's like a line about Seymour calling his wife Muriel, his poor wife, spiritual tramp of 1948, which I just thought was like so funny and iconic. And then there's this incredible description, oh my gosh, of Boo Boo Tannenbaum. Oh yeah, like this. Her joke of a name aside, her general unprettiness aside, iconic, she was, in terms of permanently memorable, immoderately perceptive, small area faces, a stunning and final girl. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I mean, the one story in this that I felt some kind of pull towards potentially reading that isn't Glass family related was with Esme, For Esme with Love and Squalor, because it kind of looked interesting in terms of form and stuff, but I didn't, and I probably won't, at least not for a while. But I'm happy with that, honestly. I'm gonna glut short story collections if I want to glut them. Could you hear what I said? Glut? That is the right one, isn't it? You know, when you like take out the insides or something for what you want. I think it has multiple uses, doesn't it? Because you can have like a glut of tomatoes or something when you have loads and loads of tomatoes that have grown in your garden, right? Anyway, and then we have another book actually. So yeah, I did read a couple books that were on my summer TBRs, and then also my August TBR that I made separate, which was Women in Translation. And this was one that was kind of on my summer TBR, but also definitely on my Women in Translation Month TBR, so I am glad I got to it. And it's another Natalia Ginzburg, shocking for this channel this year. And this is The Road to the City, and this is translated by Jeannie Al-Hadef. I'm so sorry, I've been saying it Gina, I think, which is different than the first translation that I read, which was in this edition, which it was by Frances Frenet. And I had heard from the people that I read this version with originally, who just read this version at the same time as I was reading this one, if that makes sense, that this edition, like this translation, was like more clunky or whatever, and I like did not find that whatsoever. Like, I felt like this flowed really well. I actually felt I liked the book better reading it a second time in this translation. I also felt like Delia, the main character, I felt like she came alive much more, and she was just much more fluent. And like, yeah, I don't understand how you could read this and think it was clunky. Especially interesting to go back and read this. This is Natalia Ginzburg's first novel, like her first published one, or novella. So having now read 6 or 7 or whatever of her work, I felt like also this really fit in to the narrative voice in most of her other work too. Obviously, some of it was translated by, like, I mean, none of it was translated by one person, right? That, like, she has multiple different translators, although this translator also translated The Dry Heart, I think, as well. But I think other than that, there aren't many overlaps in translator. I don't remember who did Voices in the Evening, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, they've all been different except from her first translator who did these earliest ones. I haven't read all of her work yet, but I have read, like I said, quite a large chunk of it now. So yeah, I just like this a lot. Like, much more than I liked it the first time, which maybe is because I knew what to expect, and like, this kind of shocked me with how brutal it was when I first read it, because it is pretty brutal in terms of like the setting and the sort of social life acceptance. But then I don't think the ending is especially negative, really, although it's like positive in a way that's sort of negative. But like, I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed this as like a project. I thought it was really interesting. Obviously, this is like the closest you can get, if you don't read the language in the original, to read like multiple different translations of the same work is, I guess, one way to maybe access some of that like elusive quality of the original source material, because you can see where things like really overlap and where things don't. And I did a couple times like check back to see how this one had represented bits, and I wouldn't say there were like major differences. I never felt like, oh, that's super stark as a difference, but I did feel like every time I preferred this version, which is so funny because I really like the way people were talking about it was very negative, but that's fine, you know, we all have different feelings. Sometimes I think there's this idea that like the translation with the most sort of like high register, like in terms of like very proper language, is like necessarily the most accurate. But of course that's not true at all, which isn't to say I'm always like loving translations that try to kind of modernize things by putting slang in that didn't exist in the past, but to demonstrate that the language being used was slang at that point. I'm not necessarily always pro that. I do think it just like depends on the translation and on the vibe, and also on the translator and the book and, you know, the original. Like, one of the versions of War and Peace I read, like no, I haven't read that book multiple times, I just mean I read some of bits of different translations, but the main one I read, I actually didn't like that translation very much because it did quite a lot of that kind of behavior, and I didn't think it worked very well, and I didn't like it. But anyway, this story is about Delia. I haven't actually told you that, who is like a 17-year-old girl. She lives in a large house with her fairly large dysfunctional family. A cousin of her dad's child lives with them. He's called Nini, and Delia just kind of like wants to leave her family home and like live in the city and have a life in the city and not be ashamed, and it's about what happens. It is pretty rough, and like, you know, it's also sort of like par for the course, you know what's going to happen. I literally enjoyed it so much more the second time. Like, I cannot understate that. Like okay, and then the last thing I read, finally we've got there, is actually a reread, which I have also kind of been reading for a really long time, because one time I think when I was on a train and I was really tired and I didn't know what to listen to, like an audiobook, but I was so tired, but I wanted something, so then I just found an audiobook that I had that I literally must have read like 5 years ago now. So I started listening to this audiobook of Six of Crows, which I had already read because, yeah, I just needed something, but this was probably also like 2 years ago maybe. So that's when I started re-listening to that, And then this Shabbat I decided to basically finish listening to a good chunk, maybe a third of it, maybe a bit less, I can't remember how long the audiobook is, but like I listened to it for like 5 hours or something, which was really nice. I enjoyed that a lot. I just like had a relaxing time. But yeah, it's partially because I actually started to rewatch Six of Crows, like the Netflix show, which I really like actually, especially the first season. So yeah, I was re-listening to that and I definitely enjoyed it more than I did the first time. I'm not really sure there's much to say about it. Kind of intrigued by the world, and like I do feel like a bit like with Bridgerton actually, like throwback. I think that like having watched the Netflix show, like it helps me to like feel very invested and connected with the world and the characters. I know that a couple years ago when the first season came out, I did read the first book in the first like trilogy series of it, with Alina as the main character, and I didn't like that at all. I thought it was a pretty bad book, and I felt like all of the changes made in the show were like excellent choices, and it made it much better. And obviously I don't feel that same way with Six of Crows, in the sense that like they didn't need that much editing. Like they were much less frustrating and like, you know, classic sort of, not like other girls' misogyny and like whatever, which was happening in the first book, which I guess is called Shadow and Bone, isn't it? That's why I can't think of the name. But yeah, I do struggle with being in Matthias's head. Like I really didn't like that, but I did listen to that part of it a very long time ago, so I did enjoy quite a lot like the ending, because it's all kind of coming up, and I do think I'm gonna actually read the second in that duology. Also because I am a bit sad that we didn't get to see how the Netflix show was gonna conclude it all. So part of me is like, maybe I will read the Shadow and Bone series just to see how that happens, or maybe I'll just read the Wikipedia page of that and then finish reading Crooked Kingdom. I also know that there's like another series in that as well, and it does have Nina Zelic in it, who's in Six of Crows, who I do really like as a character. I think she's great. So I was thinking I might read that. I don't know, I'm kind of trying to be like a bit more chill about what I'm reading, but I'm also really trying to read books I own. I am trying to come up with like more of a plan about like getting some balance between my academic reading and my personal reading, and then the way that I like I'm accruing books, and like trying to kind of get some more perspective and some more plans in place for that, because I've done much better this year than like last year in terms of bringing more books into my life, but at the same time like I still really want to read all of these books, and I'm not, and like part of that is because I'm like constantly trying to keep up. I do also think that this like reading things majority published before the 2000s actually has been a very hard project, and has been something that I've had to like constantly think about in a way that my other reading challenges are not. Like I can kind of read a book for it and then be like cool, whereas this I have to keep an eye on how many books I'm reading and then how many books I've read that are published before the 2000s, and then, you know, adjust accordingly. And so that that's kind of difficult, or at least for me. And it also means that if I have a lot of these barriers, I don't like enjoy that, because I don't like rules. Unless you have Hashem. I definitely need to stop talking, don't I? I've been talking for so long. Thank you so much for watching this video. Definitely let me know if you've read any of the books I mentioned, but especially Happiness as Such or The Road to the City, like if you've read either of those translations and what you think about them, or The Secret History, or yeah, if you have any good recommendations for books like Meanwood. Yeah, let me know if you've read all of a series of Unfortunate Events. Okay, well, I will talk to you when I talk to you. Bye!